component that has to be rendered on the template, right? You have a sparm element that you need to be populate this array collection. Now with the using of this directive ng for loop, that's where it's going to be render the data on the template. Now in order to perform the particular for loop, so where you need to take the help of the directive, so the directive which actually to help to render the data on the HTML, right? So that's where the directive will take the help by the templates. Templates will take the help of the directive to perform the operations, right? So again, now apart from that, you have the module component, module services, like whatever the modules, right? So everything has to be included in the modules. Okay, everything has to be included in the modules, right? So this is where exactly your Angular ng modules will perform the operation. Okay, so this is module, right? Now apart from that, everything, like all the components, whatever you are performing, creating a component or creating a directive, directives are not required to define on the module, but the injectable services component has to be defined on this particular thing. Now how these two things will work together, like what is the bare minimum requirement to make these two work, right? So that's called as your metadata. So if there is no metadata defined inside of these two things, then there is no communication will be happen between the component and the services, right? So that's where require the metadata. Okay, the similar way, if you require the same metadata to communicate between your directives also, so where you require the metadata information that required to be communicate between these two things. Okay, right? So let me take you to the same thing that I'm going to explain these things, right? So first of all, right now we don't have the services and directive, but just visualize those things. Okay, now first thing what I'm going to do is, first I'm going to take the component. So this is the component, right? So now this is called as a metadata. This data is talking about the metadata, where the communication will be built between the component and its related template, right? So this is where exactly, right? So this is my template and this is my component, and this is where the metadata was defined to make these two things work. So that's what I'm showing up over here, right? So this is a template and this is a component. In order to work it together, so where I am defining the metadata between these two things, this is the component. At the rate component decorator is acting as a metadata between your component. If this metadata was not available, if you don't define this metadata, or if you don't define this URL, then automatically this template, this particular component will never communicate with the template. There is no event binding, there is no property binding will be happen between the component and the template. Okay, so that is the primary thing, that is the relation between your component and the template. Now relation, making the relation is not only the solution to be perform the operation. So whenever something is clicked on the template, so this event will get fired and that will be notified to the component. If something get changed on the component will notify with the using the property binding operation to the template. That's how the communication will be started communicating each other, right? Now this ng for loop will talk in your templates, right? So it don't talk about the template. So this is where you are going to use the ng. This is called as your interpolations. This is where you are getting the properties, right? So the title is not available on the HTML. The title is coming from your component. This is the title. Okay, now this is called as a property, and this is a one-way property. The name online store which we are going to inject at the runtime in the template, right? Now this is called as a double curly braces closed and open is called as an interpolation. Now what the interpolation does, basically whatever the data that is available on the component, that will bring to the HTML template. That's where you will see the, when you run the application, you can see online app is running, right? So let me show you that part. So you can see this online store is coming from your app and component, and this is defined on your templates. That's what it's explaining over here, right? So the interpolation will bring the one-way binding data which is from the component to the template. Now if you want to send some data from the template to the component, there you will use the two-way binding, okay, or the data binding that has to be performed, right? So if you have a button, if you have an event, if you click on the button and that event get filed and notified to the component to execute. The similar way, if you have some data, if you want to bring it to the HTML that get populated on the HTML, there you will use the interpolation, right? So ng module is a two-way binding, which is a directive. Basically ng module is a directive, and that directive will define on the HTML to perform the two-way binding operation between your template and your component. But the interpolation basically will pull the data from the component to the HTML, will only populate the information on the template. Interpolation doesn't have the capability to notify from the template to the component. Only you require two-way binding. That will come later point. Okay. Now that is about the communication between the component. The next point that I'm going to talk about is your services. So we did not create the services. When we create the services, I'm going to show you how we are going to inject the services to the component, and all these things should be under the ng module. Your metadata has to be imported, because we already done the basic import operation on the metadata with using the ng modules and with using platforms, and these are the mandatory that is required to be performed. Now once that is done, then the next step is that you need to be talking about the complete operation. That's how this is a very basic workflow that I'm going to talk about, like what are the things that required to be perform the operation. Again, if you we have an additional components also, but at this moment I'm not talking about the additional component, because basically first you need to understand basic workflow, basic component communication on the Angular. Then we can talk about the advanced concept, how we are going to perform the routing and other stuff on the Angular component. So first we need to understand a basic workflow, like if I have a simple service which will bring the data from my Java application. Now if I pass on the data to the component, and once the component get the data, and how it's going to populate on the template, right? So this is the basic workflow that required to understand on the Angular architectural standpoint of view. That's where how a template component and services work together to populate the information on the browser section. And if you comparing and with the previous class with the JavaScript, this is my HTML file and this is my JavaScript file, as simple as that. Okay, if I create a service file, that is also one of the TS file, which is a JavaScript file. If you inject that class, so it means I created the services and the component into a single JavaScript file, and I have a template which was going to talk about my HTML CSS on, right? So that's where you need to comparing with your simple HTML with the JavaScript. This type of script anyhow it's going to be convert the JavaScript, right? So if you look at this thing, so this is how we are going to generate a simple main.js file. Okay, so finally you will get the JavaScript. You will write the code on type of script, but you will execute, you will get the JavaScript only. Now in this case, why we need to write all this type of script? Why can't we write on the JavaScript instead of, like, easiest way, right? So your annotation, definition, all this architectural implementation writing on the JavaScript, because biggest challenge, because you need to take care of all the DOM API communication and all the stuff which is not required. So here we are not talking about the document object or anything, just we'll talk about our business logic, and here I will talk about the representation logic. That's how we are done with these things. Underneath, why we need to bother about what happening behind the scope, like I can do my business logic, I can implement my business logic, I will concentration on my business logic, and the remaining part will be taken care by the compiler, and remaining part execution part will be taken care by your browser section. So only thing that where I can save a lot of time to writing, manipulating the DOM API. That's why these frameworks came into the picture. They provide the different kind of a simplest way to write the code to build the application, and that's what we adopted the frameworks. Right, sir? So this is about the basic workflow and class diagrams and architectural diagrams and fundamental configuration of your Angular. So tomorrow we are going to use the ng generate command. So where we will generate the services, where we generate the components. So first what we do is we will take a simple array, and I will show you how this array get generated on the HTML. Then I'm going to talk about some of the directives, like what is the ng for, what is the ng, what is the ng show, and other stuff. Then I'm going to talk about pipes, like if I want to do a formatting of the data, like I have a number, so I'm not sure whether it's a number or the